Hey, my name's Hubwood and today we are going to test the gaming performance of the Acer Aspire Vero, which isn't a gaming laptop at all, but an average office laptop, which costs around $600 and comes with an Intel i5-1155G7 with the Iris Xe 80EUs and in today's configuration with 16GB of DDR4 3200 MHz RAM. It's also available with the i7-1165G7, which will be around 10 to 15% faster in gaming. And I'm also sure that in some countries this laptop might come with only 8GB of RAM, which will also have an impact on some of the games that I've tested today, especially if it's 8GB of single channel memory. In that case, getting a second 8GB stick would help quite a lot. The Aspire Vero has one feature that regular office laptops don't have. It is made out of 30% recycled plastic and the packaging is fully recyclable without any plastic. Even though this is not going to be a laptop review, I will summarize some thoughts about this laptop at the end of the video if you are interested. You can use the timestamps to navigate through the video if you like. A few more things before we start with the benchmarks though. I was using the newest Intel Iris Xe drivers as of October the 5th in 2022. The CPU temperatures were actually superb thanks to the 2-fan cooling system, and the laptop's noise level is actually pretty acceptable most of the time. All games were tested with the laptop plugged in, and using the laptop on battery will give you around 2 hours of gaming and results in around 20 to 30% less performance. So most games are working quite similar to what you will see here. But for some games that means they get unplayable if you're unplugged. PS, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos like this one. Okay, enough now, let's see the games. So today's first title will be Assassin's Creed Valhalla. And like in quite a lot of today's benchmarks, I had to choose 720p and lowest settings to get playable frame rates. I saw an average of around 31 FPS with a 1% low of 12 FPS, which is what I would personally call the absolute minimum for a halfway enjoyable experience. In some more demanding areas like London, the FPS will drop to the mid-20s though, and I have to point out that the game doesn't look very good using these settings. Especially the vegetation is lacking visual fidelity. But at the end of the day, you could run it that way, if you're okay with that. In Anno 1800, it's not that important to get high frame rates all the time, and I was therefore able to actually use 1080p and low settings. Unfortunately, using FSR didn't seem to work for me as the game would crash upon loading my save game. But nonetheless, I was getting around 30 FPS depending on zoom level and city size. I would definitely call this enjoyable, even though the frame times weren't stable. But again, Anno 1800 isn't about performance and 30 FPS are fine considering the laptop. In Apex Legends, I was getting an average of 48 FPS on the lowest settings at 720p with a 1% low of around 25 FPS. The FPS varied from 30 to 60 FPS, which isn't perfect, but it's okay for some casual gaming if you're not too ambitious. Frame times seem to be kinda stable and I would call it playable to at least some extent. Considering this is free to play anyway, it's not like you'll have to lose anything except for the time it takes to download the game. In Battlefield 5, I was using 720p once more with lowest graphic settings in DirectX 11 and saw an average of 37 to 40 FPS depending on the map and a 1% low of 27. There will be some hiccups here and there, but it's just like Apex Legends, playable to some extent. Keep in mind that spotting enemies in games like this gets a lot harder if the resolution is as low as 720p though. It's okay for some casual fun matches here and there, but don't expect too much. Another multiplayer shooter I've tested was Call of Duty Warzone at 720p in the lowest settings, resulting in an average of approximately 41 FPS and a 1% low of 27. The experience was very similar to Battlefield 5, some hiccups, and enemy spotting is once more quite a bit more difficult due to the resolution. Considering this laptop only has mediocre integrated graphics, I'm actually surprised it's playable at all though. So, let's see what's next. In my opinion, Control manages to look pretty good even at 720p and low settings, especially on a small 15-inch screen like the Acer Aspire Vero has to offer. I saw an average of around 36 FPS and a 1% low of 23 FPS. Considering this is about PlayStation 3 level, I'd say it's playable. One could actually think about capping the FPS at 30 to get smoother frame times and less hiccups. It's not super optimal, but it's doable and it's kinda enjoyable. Cyberpunk 2077 is at the brink of being playable on this laptop, using 720p lowest settings with low population density plus FSR in performance mode resulted in an average of only 29 FPS and a 1% low of 19. Especially the already difficult driving situation of this game becomes even harder on this laptop, so I am, to be honest, not sure if I would recommend playing the game that way. It's really looking blurry and washed out, but if this is absolutely your only option to play the game, well, I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to you. At least the story and the sound aren't suffering that way, so I don't know, you decide. Next. In CSGO, I was using 1080p and the lowest settings, resulting in 58 FPS and a 1% low of 23 after 20 minutes of gaming. Ignore the low 1% FPS shown here. There was some hiccups in the beginning of the recording that tend to screw up my benchmarking, but these issues usually go away after a while of gaming. Using 900p and capping the FPS at 60 would most certainly be another option you could choose. Considering that I've been playing Counter-Strike 1.6 with a much lower 4:3 aspect ratio and mostly fewer FPS back in 2003, I would definitely say yes, you can play it that way. I was also testing Diablo 3 on medium to high settings at 1080p, yeah, you heard me, and I saw an average of between around 54 to 70 FPS depending on the portal I was testing. Of course, this is perfectly playable and you'd have a lot of options to even further raise the frame rate if you prefer that by lowering the graphics. So without further ado, we'll check out the next game. I was testing the new free-to-play eFootball successor of the Pro Evolution Soccer series. At 1080p lowest settings and a resolution scaling of 60%, which equals 720p, I was getting an average of 48 FPS and a 1% low of 11. Since I was even able to score a goal in the first match I've ever played in this game, and I don't really play these games, I'd say, yeah, it's playable. And I should have passed the ball to number 11 here, I know that. Thank you for pointing that out. Next. Okay, many of you were probably jumping forward to this game, Elden Ring. At 720p in the lowest settings, I was getting around 29 FPS in the other levels and around 45 FPS in the boss fight against Malenia. And I would say it's doable. It's not perfect, but again, considering the kind of laptop we're talking about, it's fine in my opinion. And be aware though that Elden Ring looks blurry and has severe aliasing issues on 720p and the lowest settings. Just pretend it's part of Elden Ring's lands in between and the story. I'm kidding, there is no story in Elden Ring, yeah, I've said that. So I was testing Fallout 4 at 1080p and 720p likewise. At 1080p and low settings, I saw an average of around 41 FPS and a 1% low of 15 FPS. Playable, but not perfect. At 720p though, I was able to achieve an almost constant 60 FPS, and the game felt a lot better this way. Remember, you always have the 900p option as well, and the 15-inch screen is kinda forgiving on lower resolutions, as mentioned before. In Fall Guys, I was choosing low settings at 1080p and saw an average of between 30 and 60 FPS, depending a lot on the given map. I even managed to score second place in the benchmark run, which should kinda prove that it's absolutely playable. Of course, higher FPS mean lower frame times, which means less input lag, but it's still alright in my opinion. So check, and next. In Fortnite, I was using the performance mode on low, which actually resulted in playable FPS at both 1080p and 720p. At 1080p I was getting around 61 FPS and a 1% low of 30 FPS. At 720p I was getting around 84 FPS on average with a 1% low of 29 FPS. In both cases the game is playable and enjoyable, even though it doesn't look super good, of course, since I was using the performance mode, which is making quite some visual compromises. Interestingly, the CPU and GPU usage aren't even close to what they could be. I don't know if the OSD wasn't reading the values right or if it's the game's engine causing that. Forza Horizon 5 unfortunately didn't work since it crashed on startup no matter which drivers I used. So I went with Forza Horizon 4 instead, but since the Afterburner OSD isn't working with Forza, we'll have to go with the Xbox overlay instead. At 1080p and low settings, I was getting around 45 to 60 FPS and it felt enjoyable and definitely playable. The game even doesn't look that bad in my opinion. If you need a stable 60, you could of course go for 900 or 720p, where you would probably even be able to use some medium settings and still maintain the 60 FPS when capped. I was expecting GTA 5 to run at least okay at 1080p and low settings, which are called normal in the graphics menu. I saw an average of around 36 FPS and a stable 1% low of 27 FPS, which basically would allow to raise some settings and reach pretty much the PlayStation 3 level of detail with around 30 FPS. Since you're not expecting 60 FPS when playing on the Acer Vero, I would once more call this just fine. Playing games like that on a lower budget / medium office laptop 10 years ago was absolutely unthinkable, but yet here we are. To further widen the test range, I also fired up Life is Strange True Colors at 1080p and low settings and got a playable average of somewhat around 35 to 40, with a 1% low of around 21 FPS depending on the scene. The game doesn't actually need high FPS as the story and visuals are the absolute main focus here. So I actually also tested the medium preset, which resulted in 25 to 40 FPS and a 1% low of 19. If you're okay with that, I'd say that this game is actually playable that way. Using 900p would also be an option once more. League of Legends on maximum settings and 1080p was of course running perfectly fine with an average of 100 FPS and a 1% low of 74 FPS. Yeah, I am aware that I'm not using Nidali in a correct way. Sorry, I'm not actually playing LOL, so please forgive me. However, this game running so well wasn't a real surprise, so how about we'll just continue with the next game for today? To be honest, I was expecting a bit more from Overwatch 2 though, as on 1080p and the lowest settings I saw an average of 51 FPS and a 1% low of only 16. So I also benchmarked 720p on low, which resulted in an average of 83 FPS and a relatively low 1% low FPS of 27, which allowed for a perfectly smooth gameplay though. If anyone knows about performance issues with Overwatch 2 versus Overwatch 1, please let me know in the comments. Red Dead Redemption 2 was playable at 720p and the lowest settings with a capped FPS at 30. That actually allowed the 1% low to stay at 30 as well, and the gameplay was at a PS3 console level from around 2010 maybe, I would say. If I had to choose between not playing the game at all and playing it that way, I would actually play it that way. It's possible that the FPS will drop below 30 in some scenes or areas, as I didn't test the whole map. Rocket League was running well at 1080p and low settings with an average of 58 FPS and a 1% low of 31 FPS in a 3 vs 3 match. The frame times weren't perfectly smooth, but that didn't bother me too much, as there were no real stuttering or bigger issues present. The game is actually playable really well, but to be honest, I didn't expect anything less in that case. I was also testing The Sims. And to be clear, I have no idea on how to play this game, so I was just playing around a bit. And I was even able to use ultra settings at 1080p, and the game seemed to work just fine with an average of 37 FPS and a 1% low of 6 FPS. But I think the 1% low would become more stable after playing a while longer. I also don't think that a more crowded house would make much more difference, as the i5 seemed to be completely bored out in this title, and there should be a lot of headroom for much more complex situations. I was testing the deathmatch mode in Valorant at 1080p and low settings and saw an average of 121 with a good 1% low of around 73 FPS. So this is another example of a game that runs perfectly well on the Acer Aspire Vero. Of course, the display only offers 60 Hz, but the input lag is still profiting from the high FPS I saw in this title. The frame time graph was really smooth as well. At 1080p and low settings, The Witcher 3 was running with an average of 28 FPS and a 1% low of around 13. But once again, playing a while longer could probably raise the 1% low a bit, once everything in the game has to offer was able to load. From my experience, 4-core CPUs tend to cause some frame time and stuttering issues in this game. I also tested 900p to make sure I would get a stable 30 FPS on average, and actually saw an average of around 35 and a 1% low of 22 FPS when doing so. In my opinion, the game still looks good enough that way, and it's enjoyable enough to justify purchasing this game on the Acer Vero. Acer Vero? Acer Vero. The last title for today was World of Warcraft at 1080p, using the quality level at 5, which is comparable to a medium quality preset. I saw an average of around 44 FPS and a 1% low of around 30 FPS. The FPS depend a lot on the area, and of course big rates will cause the FPS to drop a bit. On the older levels and areas you would probably get higher FPS. But the 8-thread CPU and the 16GB of relatively fast DDR4 RAM should be capable of handling that even when using a few add-ons. On the lowest quality level, which is 1, the average FPS rose to around 95 FPS and a 1% low of around 50 FPS. So this would be the maximum that one could achieve at 1080p using this laptop. So this was the last game for today, but before I'll summarize some thoughts on the Acer Aspire Vero, here's a quick list of some popular and older games that should just run perfectly fine at 1080p or at least at 720p on this laptop. And in short, almost every game until 2019 or 2020 and most indie games and less demanding titles since then should basically run in some way which is enjoyable. If you're a casual gamer, and yeah, you know what I mean. Okay, so I am absolutely aware that the Acer Aspire Vero is not a gaming laptop. But if you've come this far, you're probably thinking about getting one, or you already own one and you're wondering if it is able to play some games here and there. And the answer is definitely yes, to some extent, at least with older and less demanding games. But aside from that, the Acer Aspire Vero is a decent mid-level office laptop for people that would at least like to try to use more sustainable hardware. As a quick conclusion, I would say that it offers a decent quality and a good variety of connections, as well as an okay screen and a nice touchpad with a reliable fingerprint sensor. I think it's also the first laptop that I've ever tested which has a case that is completely immune to fingerprints due to its rough texture. It doesn't look or feel premium, but I would actually prefer that over a shiny surface which gets dirty just after seconds of using it. I also really liked that it has 2 fans with direct access to the airflow grid, despite the low power consumption it has, which results in a really low CPU temperature even under full load. Outstanding for a laptop, to be honest. And it stays pretty quiet as well, even when gaming. And I want to point out that it's kinda easy to open it up and upgrade the hard drive or the RAM and swap out the battery. Unfortunately, it doesn't offer a second M.2 slot or an HDD slot, which is one of my biggest points of criticism that I have for the Acer Vero. PS, Acer, please make a decent gaming laptop with this recycled material. I would love to test that, and I'd probably get one for myself. It would be amazing if you could also add some fair trade materials and stop using plastic for the packaging on all of your laptops, as this was a really nice experience. So, if you liked this video, please leave a like or a subscribe, and if it answered any of your questions and really helped you, it would be amazing if you could afford a $1 super like or super thanks. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and tschüss.